Welcome to the Retro Review. History is more than dates and names. It is a collection of moments that shaped our world, changed nations, and influenced generations. On this channel, we explore the greatest historical events, legendary leaders, forgotten stories, and the decisions that changed the course of history. Our goal is not to decide who was right or wrong. We present the facts, the context, and the consequences, so you can form your own opinion. Every story has two sides. Every decision has a price. This is the Retro Review. Let's travel back in time.
The 13 days that nearly ended the world. The Cuban Missile Crisis, October 1962. For 13 days, the world stood on the edge of nuclear war. American spy planes had discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. If those missiles became operational, cities across the United States could be hit in minutes. Washington was furious. Moscow refused to back down. Cuba was preparing for invasion. Military commanders on both sides were arming for a conflict that could have killed tens of millions of people. This wasn't just another Cold War standoff. This was the moment when one wrong order, one misunderstood signal, or one panicked commander could have triggered World War III. And the most terrifying part, it almost happened. To understand why the Cuban Missile Crisis was so dangerous, we need to go back a little. After World War II, the world split into two rival superpowers. On one side was the United States, leading the capitalist Western Bloc. On the other side was the Soviet Union, leading the communist Eastern Bloc. Neither side trusted the other. Both were armed with nuclear weapons. Both were building alliances, military bases, missiles, and influence around the world. This period became known as the Cold War. It was called Cold because the United States and the Soviet Union never fought each other directly in a full-scale war, but the tension was always there, like two men holding loaded guns in a locked room. And by the late 1950s, that room was getting very crowded. The Soviets were testing missiles. The Americans had nuclear weapons stationed in Europe and in Turkey, close to Soviet territory. Each side feared being outmatched by the other. Each side believed weakness could be fatal. Then came Cuba. In 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew the Cuban government and took power. Cuba was right next to the United States, and Washington saw Castro's new revolutionary government as a major threat, especially when Cuba began moving closer to Moscow. For the Soviet Union, Cuba was a golden opportunity. For the United States, it was a nightmare. In 1961, the United States backed a plan to overthrow Fidel Castro. The idea was simple on paper and disastrous in reality. A force of Cuban exiles, trained and supported by the CIA, landed at the Bay of Pigs invasion. The hope was that they would spark an uprising and topple Castro's government. Instead, the invasion collapsed almost immediately. Castro's forces crushed the attackers. The operation became a public embarrassment for the young American president, John F. Kennedy. It also convinced Castro that the United States would try again. That fear mattered. Because after the Bay of Pigs, Castro wanted protection, real protection, not speeches, not promises, missiles, and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev saw an opportunity. If the United States could place nuclear missiles near the Soviet Union in Turkey, why couldn't the Soviet Union place nuclear missiles near the United States in Cuba? From Khrushchev's perspective, this wasn't just aggression, it was balance, it was leverage. It was revenge for the strategic pressure America had placed on the USSR for years. So the Soviets made a secret decision. They would send nuclear missiles to Cuba, quietly, fast. And if everything went according to plan, the Americans wouldn't realize what had happened until it was too late. In the summer of 1962, Soviet ships began moving toward Cuba, carrying troops, equipment, and missile components. The operation was cloaked in secrecy. Soviet soldiers were told misleading stories. Construction sites in Cuba were hidden as much as possible. Moscow hoped to complete the deployment before Washington fully understood what was happening, but secrecy has a weakness. Eventually, someone looks up. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane flew over Cuba and took photographs of missile sites under construction. The photos were analyzed the next day. What they showed was chilling. The Soviet Union was building launch sites for medium-range nuclear missiles in Cuba. These were not defensive weapons in the abstract. These were nuclear strike weapons capable of reaching much of the eastern and central United States. The White House was suddenly staring at the unthinkable. A hostile nuclear arsenal was being installed practically on America's doorstep. When President Kennedy was informed, he faced one of the most dangerous decisions any leader has ever had to make. Do nothing, and the missiles might become fully operational. Launch an airstrike, and the Soviet Union might retaliate. Invade Cuba, and nuclear war could begin. Every option looked like a trap. Kennedy created a secret advisory group called ExComm, short for the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. Inside that room, America's top officials argued over what to do. Some demanded immediate airstrikes to destroy the missile sites. Others wanted a full invasion of Cuba. Some warned that either option could provoke the Soviets into attacking Berlin, Europe, or even the United States itself. Kennedy needed a move that showed strength without instantly starting a war, so he chose a middle path. The United States would impose a naval quarantine around Cuba. Technically, it was called a quarantine rather than a blockade because a blockade is considered an act of war under international law. But everyone understood what it meant. American warships would stop Soviet vessels from delivering more military equipment to Cuba. On October 22, 1962, Kennedy went on television and addressed the world. He revealed the existence of the missiles. He warned that any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere would be regarded as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response. In plain language, Kennedy was saying this: if one of those missiles launches, we will consider it the start of nuclear war. The world froze, people began stocking food, families feared the worst. Military forces were placed on alert. In Washington and Moscow, men with maps and telephones were now deciding the fate of humanity. And then the Soviet ships kept moving toward Cuba. This was the moment the crisis could have exploded. American naval forces were positioned to intercept Soviet ships approaching the quarantine line. If the Soviet captains tried to break through, the U.S. Navy might fire. If the U.S. Navy fired, Moscow might respond. If Moscow responded, escalation could become unstoppable. For hours, the world waited. Then, in one of the most important non-battles in history, several Soviet ships either slowed down or turned back. It was a sign that Khrushchev was not eager to trigger a direct military clash at sea. But the danger was far from over. The missiles already in Cuba were still there. Construction continued. Soviet personnel remained on the island. American generals kept pushing for stronger action, and both superpowers were still surrounded by fear, pride, and nuclear weapons. This was no longer a simple standoff. It had become a countdown. If there was one day when the world came closest to nuclear war, it was October 27, 1962. Historians often call it Black Saturday. That day, several terrifying events unfolded almost at once. First, a US U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, was killed. Now Kennedy faced enormous pressure to retaliate. At the same time, another U-2 accidentally strayed over Soviet territory near Alaska, risking an entirely separate military confrontation. And beneath the ocean, something even more frightening was happening. American warships were trying to force a Soviet submarine to surface by dropping practice depth charges. What the Americans did not know was that this submarine B-59 was carrying a nuclear torpedo. Inside the submarine, conditions were miserable. It was hot, cramped, and communication with Moscow had been cut off. The crew believed war might already have started. The captain considered launching the nuclear torpedo. If he had done it, the United States would almost certainly have responded with overwhelming force. The nuclear exchange everyone feared might have begun right there in the Caribbean Sea. But one man helped stop it. A Soviet officer named Vasily Arkhipov opposed the launch. He argued against firing. Because of that decision, the torpedo was not launched. It is not an exaggeration to say that one calm voice inside one submarine may have helped save the world. And yet, even after all this, the crisis was still not over. During the crisis, Kennedy and Khrushchev exchanged urgent messages. Khrushchev first sent a letter that sounded emotional, personal, almost desperate. In it, he suggested a deal. The Soviet Union would remove the missiles from Cuba if the United States promised not to invade Cuba. Then a second message arrived, harsher and more demanding. This time the Soviets wanted something more. The United States should also remove its nuclear missiles from Turkey. Now Kennedy had a problem. If he publicly accepted the Turkey demand, it might look like America had backed down under nuclear pressure. If he rejected it, the crisis could continue spiraling. So the White House crafted a careful response. Publicly, Kennedy accepted the first offer: no invasion of Cuba in exchange for missile removal. Privately, the United States also signaled that it would remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey later, as long as the deal remained secret. This gave Khrushchev a way out. On October 28, 1962, Radio Moscow announced that the Soviet Union would dismantle and withdraw the missiles from Cuba. The world stepped back from the cliff, not because one side crushed the other, not because anyone won cleanly, but because, at the last possible moment, both sides decided survival mattered more than pride.
On the surface, the United States appeared to win. The Soviet missiles were removed from Cuba. Kennedy looked strong. Khrushchev appeared to have retreated under pressure. But history is rarely that neat. The United States secretly agreed to remove missiles from Turkey. Cuba remained under Castro's rule, and both Washington and Moscow walked away deeply shaken by how close they had come to catastrophe. The crisis changed the Cold War. A direct communication line, often called the hotline, was later established between Washington and Moscow so leaders could communicate faster during emergencies. Nuclear arms control efforts slowly gained momentum. Both sides had seen the abyss, and neither liked what stared back. The Cuban Missile Crisis became a lesson in fear, power, miscalculation, and restraint. It showed that wars are not always started by evil masterminds making dramatic speeches. Sometimes they begin because leaders feel cornered, because militaries are on edge, because information is incomplete, because nobody wants to look weak, because events move faster than human judgment. And when nuclear weapons are involved, that kind of chaos is enough to threaten civilization itself. For 13 days in October 1962, humanity held its breath. A president in Washington, a premier in Moscow, a revolutionary in Havana. Generals, submarine officers, pilots, intelligence analysts, and frightened civilians all became part of one of the most dangerous moments in human history. The missiles were removed. The war never came. But the fact that the world survived does not make the story comforting. It makes it terrifying, because if a few choices had gone differently, if one submarine officer had said yes instead of no, if one airstrike had been ordered, if one captain had misread one command, this could have been the story of how the modern world ended. And that is why the Cuban Missile Crisis still matters, not as an old Cold War relic, but as a warning. Because the most dangerous moments in history are often the ones where everyone thinks they still have time. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more world history stories, forgotten conflicts, empires, revolutions, betrayals, and moments that changed civilization forever.
Thank you for watching the Retro Review. History is full of questions that still spark debate today. What do you think? Was the decision justified, or could history have taken a different path? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the Retro Review, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next exploration of history. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep history alive.